Good morning, friends. One thing I find intriguing to point out is that just before the Apostle Paul launches into the list of qualifications for church elders in 1 Timothy 3, he writes the following: "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task." Now let's think about this for a minute, because the Apostle Paul places an emphasis on this statement as being true. He reassures us the saying is trustworthy. In other words, this statement that if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task, that statement right there is a trustworthy one. It's almost like when Jesus, in his own earthly ministry, when he wanted to really emphasize the importance of what he was about to say, he would start off by saying, "Truly, truly, I say to you." And Paul opens up with that same sort of reinforcement about the validity and the importance of what he was about to say. And I think the reason he does this is because it is quite natural to think that people should not aspire to the position of overseer or elder, right? Because if a man actually aspires to that position, if he wants to be an elder, especially if he's passionate about the prospect of being an elder, well, in our natural cynical minds, all sorts of red flags go up, don't they? I mean, why does this man want to be an elder so badly? Does he just want the authority or the status of being a leader in the church? Does he just want to have social credit to puff himself up, putting himself at the center of everything? Does he want to be that meddler that we warned about in Sunday's sermon? The man who does want to be involved in the lives of the people for all the wrong reasons. And sometimes if a particular man shows an actual desire to be an elder, we immediately jump to the assumption that his desire must be born out of one of those illegitimate reasons for being an elder. And yet, in the text itself, Paul indicates that the man who aspires to be an elder, he aspires to a noble task. The implication being that his aspiration to that task should also be seen as noble. Which doesn't mean it's impossible for someone to be improperly motivated. We obviously do want to be on the lookout for those folks, and that's why the testing and the qualifications for eldership exists. But I think what Paul is telling us here is that if a man does aspire, if he genuinely does seek out eldership, we should not default to one of those cynical assumptions about why he's seeking it out. It may be that the Lord is calling him to be an elder, and he's responding to that call with joy. That the reason he desires to be an elder is because it is a noble task, and he's excited about engaging in such a noble task as the Lord calls him. And part of why I point this out is because sometimes, at least basing things off of my own experience, my own personal thoughts and observations, sometimes we think that since elders do need to be humble, and of course they do, but since elders need to be humble, then that means they have to have such a poor outlook on themselves, have such a poor outlook on their own qualifications, and humility would then require that their aspirations should not be so high, if they really are humble, and therefore a genuinely qualified elder must essentially be dragged into the role by other people, because he's just so humble that he would never actually aspire to it, that he would never actually say, yes, the Lord is calling me to do this, and I'm qualified to do this, and I want to do this, because that might come across as prideful, right? But sometimes I think we get a warped idea of that line between humility and pride. Now, of course, if a man starts to visit a church, and after 3 months he approaches the leadership and says, "God is calling me to be an elder in this church, you need to make me an elder." Well, yeah, there's probably a significant element of pride there. Certainly there's an element of rashness there, because the church and its leaders don't know that man yet. He certainly hasn't been examined, and whatever qualifications he might have certainly haven't been demonstrated yet. And it's a prideful thing to come in and make demands like that. But that doesn't mean it is prideful to still approach the church elders, the current church leadership, and say to them, I think the Lord is calling me to be an elder one day, and I think if I'm not already qualified, I want to be qualified. I want to be used by God and his church. I want to be part of what he's doing. Would you be willing to examine me, to look at my life? And if I'm not qualified already, would you elders disciple me so that one day I could be qualified and so minister in the way I think the Lord is calling me to? Now, friends, if a man in the church that I serve as an elder in, if a man came up to me and said those words, especially if it was with contriteness of heart, I'd probably cry for joy right there on the spot. Not just because we'd love to have more qualified elders, though we would, but because a man coming to me, to us, the elders as a whole, expressing those words with contriteness of heart, that would demonstrate an awesome and humble aspiration. Because aspiration all on its own does not automatically equal pride. If your aspiration is to do what God wills, then that aspiration is actually a display of humility and obedience. And so it's okay for a man to want to be an elder, to aspire to the eldership, to be eager for eldership. And of course, this is also why the Apostle Paul follows that statement up with the actual qualifications to be an elder. Because it is also possible for a man to aspire to that position and to aspire correctly, that the Lord is calling that man to be an elder one day. But it might just be that in considering the actual qualifications that are required, that man then realizes that he's got a long way to go before it can actually happen. And in that realization, if he responds correctly, if he does respond humbly in that realization, then that will spur him toward even greater spiritual growth. It will spur him to reach out to the current elders once again to seek discipleship, that they might be able to specifically train him and guide him in that spiritual growth toward the goal of being an elder. Because when you really think about it, the vast majority of qualifications for eldership are things that all Christians ought to be striving for anyway. No, not all Christians need to be able to teach, and that is one of the requirements for elders. But look at the rest of them. What about being self-controlled, being gentle, not being a lover of money? If you have a family, if you have a household, governing your household well, right? Those are qualifications for eldership. But aren't they also character traits that all Christians should persevere in? Of course they are. And so for the most part, elders are just like everyone else. They're hopefully just further down that same road of spiritual maturity in Christ, such that they are more gentle than the average man in the church. They are more self-controlled and more hospitable and more respectable than others. Again, as we went over at length in yesterday's devotion, they're not going to be perfect, and they certainly should not be set on a pedestal and viewed as being better than other people in the church, because we are all where we are on that road of sanctification by the grace of God. So if we boast only in the Lord and what he has done, and give all the credit to him, and we declare that he is good, not any one of us. But with all this in mind, we realize all the more why aspiring to the role of elder is a good thing. Because even if a man is not currently qualified, and maybe it's going to be years before he is qualified, but still the desire to be qualified drives him to seek ever greater spiritual maturity in the Lord. And that's a good thing in its own right, of course. Because again, in the vast majority of cases, we should all be persevering to meet the qualifications of eldership. Not so that we can be elders, but because there's other qualifications that might prohibit us, but because so many of those qualifications are qualities that all Christians should strive for regardless. Therefore, as we close, I hope and pray that there will be so many men, perhaps as a result of my teaching or by whatever other means the Lord intends to use. But it's my prayer that God's church here in this place and in the world over would experience a massive wave of men who aspire to be church elders, who desire to minister in humility and faithfulness before the Lord and for the sake of his people, to be shepherds watching over, feeding, and protecting the sheep of God. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.